right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Dharma Digs podcast, a podcast in pursuit of purposeful living. As I say always, I'm extremely grateful that you've decided to take a little bit of time out of your day to stop by and tune into this podcast, so thank you once again for being here. If you are new to the show, I appreciate you as well, and if you haven't already, tap that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, it's right below the video to the bottom right. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever it is you are listening, find a way to follow and subscribe there, and if you feel so inclined, would love for you to leave a little bit of a review for this as well. You probably don't understand how important and how helpful that is for folks like myself that are trying to get and reach more listeners. So thanks though for being here, and I'm excited to share this conversation with you today. It is with Madeline Crone, who is a staff writer at American Songwriter Magazine, which this day and age they do still put out, I believe, a physical print edition, but they are just staying super busy putting out digital content, digital stories, and I've been super impressed with the work that Madeline's put out there as well. And Madeline and I came to meet through a mutual friend in the industry, and we worked a little bit on the Bristol Rhythm and Roots reunion story together this year, so it was an honor to have her on the show. And this conversation, we talk a little bit about, of course, how she's finding purpose in her days as a staff writer at American Songwriter, and really touch a little bit on kind of what led her down that journey or that path to working in that role. Interestingly enough, I was surprised to find out that she didn't even have a journalism background, but if you read her work, you would not know it. But we also talk a little bit about some of the stories that she's shared through other people's stories and how they've impacted her life, how maybe it's changed her perspective on things, and how it's opened up an opportunity for us as listeners and as readers of her work to maybe apply some of the things that we're learning through these stories into our day-to-day. So this was a really fun conversation. I was really intrigued by some of the inside conversations that she's had and where that's led her, and I think you will be too. So without further ado, let's get right on into the conversation with Madeline Crone. Hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the Dharma Digs podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Dharma Digs podcast, and this week I've got Madeline Crone on with me. Did I pronounce your last name right? I should have asked you that.
Yes, you got it. Thanks. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your day. And I just told the guests or the listeners a brief introduction to you, but why don't you maybe give us a quick overview of kind of where you are within your writing career? Because I think that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, but maybe what led you to where you are and kind of what you're up to these days.
Sure. So I am a staff writer with American Songwriter Magazine, which is a new step in the process for me. I started full-time with them March 1st. Before then, I was doing some freelance work, somewhere between political advertising, digital marketing, social media writing. Something that I came into, over the last 2 years. I couldn't find a boss that would send me in the right direction, and I somehow ended up in charge of myself. So besides tax season, which is now, it's been pretty awesome, and it worked well in my favor. So the last 5 weeks or so have been full days of writing, turning news, doing more than I would do normally in a month in a day. So not a lot of sleep, but it's been a wonderful experience, and I'm really excited. So it's good timing for our conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't have that frame of reference. You and I got connected through a friend of our mutual friend and work colleague with Danielle Drouar, and I didn't have the frame of reference. I knew obviously that you wrote for American Songwriter, and I've done my own digging on you a little bit. But congrats, I should say. That is an exciting kind of step in a full-time direction there, I suppose.
Yes, thank you. It was definitely unexpected. I think just given the direction with digital media, I feel really thankful for my role in that world. This year, it's kept me, employed and paid and fed. But because of the demand with digital media, I think the step for American Songwriter, like other publications, is, to step away from so much of the freelance different stories and being able to keep up with what's going on in real time, cover songs as they come out within the hour, or, announcements as they come up, especially now announcing tours coming back, thankfully, and concerts. and all that. So it's been a great blend of what I was doing in the past and then, learning to not be such a perfectionist and just, turn a presser around if it's a presser. So
Right, put it out there and kind of move on.
yes.
That is something I noticed in looking through American Songwriter website and kind of your catalog within all of the articles and media that they're putting out, and I was amazed and shocked at the amount of stuff that the articles and different pieces you've written and put out in the last, really, like you said, like the last 3 or 4 weeks was just super impressive. And I didn't, again, have that frame of reference that to the degree of writing that you're doing, which is amazing. And I'm sure I would venture to guess that that is pretty fulfilling, obviously, from a standpoint of just being able to kind of fully focus on that, as opposed to feeling, as a freelancer myself, sometimes you feel pulled in many different directions, whereas now you're still pulled in different directions, but it's for really cool and fun projects, I suppose.
Yes, definitely. So I was at a bit of a crossroads when this came up, whether I wanted to dive into writing full time and if that meant, taking out another loan and going to school or, uh, you know, expanding on the publications I was contributing to. And, because it's hard to I want to put my whole heart and mind into whatever I'm doing. And as a pretty distracted person, it's nice for me to have several balls up in the air. But now with this opportunity, which I'm so thankful for, I'm able to maintain that still necessary chaos. If I have news stories and profiles I'm working on and interviews to prepare for, I'm able to jump back and forth, but within a focused realm, which is definitely, like you said, been fulfilling for me.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and that kind of leads me to a question that I ask all of my guests, and you can apply it however you'd like, or maybe kind of pull whatever resources from your either current experience or just your writing experience in general. But what within that craft and that art form do you find as like a definition, or maybe like a sense of purpose, or and how do you define that, if you do at all?
Sure. So this was probably an insecurity of mine to begin with, which is funny. So I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that's where I've circled back to now. I have family here and friends here and feel very rooted in this community. But my dad, he was born in 1959 and is also from the eastern part of North Carolina. So growing up in the music he shared in central North Carolina, having such a strong little micro community here, I've just so much of the folk influence from this area. I've loved to learn how it's expanded to popular music, even as a kid. So I sort of nerded out on all of that. I went to school in Tennessee, Swanee, Tennessee, which has musical roots as well, being close to Nashville. But something that always kept me from pursuing it was I don't have a musical bone in my body. I appreciate music because I of the way that it makes me feel, but I couldn't tell you what they're doing to make you feel that way. And I still, I'll learn and I'll try, but you have it or you don't. My sister can pick up any instrument and play it. I'm blown away by it. But I think what I've realized is that brings, that's become a strength of mine as a storyteller. I was a psychology major. I am a extrovert probably to a fault, and just collecting stories from people from a non-musical approach, I think, is something that gives people a reason. People that are bogged down by media and interviews, I think, sometimes to come in with a totally different perspective and just want to hear the story, what was happening in their life that got them to that point, or what it felt like when they were making that, or looking back, what does that sound like to them? Because I don't know what that was like for them to make the music, but I'm interested in what got them there. So coming into the music industry, I started from an intern perspective. I was on campus, I was a volunteer for St. Jude, so a fundraising representative for campus, and they run an excellent program with that where they teach you all about what it means to ask for money for a nonprofit, which can feel funny, as a 20-something-year-old, and what it means to bring the community together around something and, create movement within your community, and educating you with all the resources to do that. So something I started on campus was a concert series, and I called upon a band, Boy Named Banjo, who is a Swanee band. They were a year ahead of me, so they were gracious enough to come and play for me for 2 years. But we also went through the contract process of bringing on Chatham County Line, which is a Central North Carolina based band. Sorry, this story just went way long, but I'll keep going with it. So in that process of bringing them on, I was able to connect. I got to understand what it means to get a contract, a writer, find the dates, communicate with managers, booking agents, publicists, all of what it means, to get someone to come play, which blew my mind. And I was like, well, you don't have to play an instrument to do that, and you're still part of this and can appreciate the process. So that drew me in to the industry, and I worked as a booking agent intern one summer, and then I got into management and that was sort of in a rootsy bluegrass smaller level, which I really liked. And then the next summer it brought me in on a larger scale to a really commercial day-to-day management company, that I was doing all their errands, no job too small, which I still understand. I worked in hospitality and all of that, but that it was when I got to that point, after I thought I was so sure about music, that I dead stopped, because it wasn't fulfilling me the way I wanted to. I was like, this is so cool. I get to go drop off, dry cleaning for these famous people before their award shows. And at the end of the summer, they offered me a job. Not that it was a livable salary anyways, but I was shocked that it wasn't what I wanted, and really disappointed by that. So speed it up a bit. I took other jobs. I lived in DC. I've worked in hospitality, public relations, like I said, social media. And when the opportunity came up with American Songwriter to freelance, I started to get back into, what it was that brought me in the first place. And it was just sort of the connection, the somewhat distant third degree connection to music, as someone who appreciates it and appreciates, the community around it and the people behind it. So I just feel really lucky that it happened this way, but it definitely wasn't a direct path here.
Yeah, it rarely is. I find personally, and
Yeah.
and specifically, like speaking to your points about the industry and kind of being fortunate to have seen different facets of it. Because myself as a musician, I started thinking like, yeah, I want to, of course, like the dream is to play music and be successful enough to pay your bills by doing that. But that shifted for me right after college too, to realize that through then going into graduate school to realize like there's a whole underlying area of business that most of your average folks don't think about when it comes to producing music shows, events, festivals, how the agency side works versus the promoter side, all those things. So it's cool to hear that you've been through kind of a lot of those facets as opposed to just like only one angle. But what I'm curious about there is like with American Songwriter, you didn't go to school for journalism, you went for psychology, and you had all these other roles within the industry. But how did that connection with American Songwriter from a writing standpoint really even come to fruition?
It honestly, I have, I'm sure that there's reasons. I'm not a good person to ask, but some days I'm like, I have no idea. I applied for an internship through them at the end of my senior year, and I actually ended up taking another one. There was an alumni of the college I went to who very graciously offered, it was more of like a mentor program. He would pay a stipend to the student that he selected for this internship. It's Jay Williams. He's a partner at William Morris Endeavor in Nashville, and he has, like we said, a story that not a straight line that got him into the industry. And it's not something that's always taught at a liberal arts school. So he would bring students on ask them what they were interested in and sort of place them within his network, which was really unbelievable. So I took that opportunity before I even heard back from American Songwriter, but it was something that had been on my radar. So I actually just had LinkedIn notifications on. I was feeling sort of lost in that moment, and I guess the email that I reached out to Dallas, who's still someone that I report to, an editor there, it was compelling enough that he gave me a chance. They were bringing on a team of freelancers that, in addition to pitching stories, we would take assignments, which is sort of a unique position within journalism for freelancers, but it worked well until we arrived at this most recent point. And I think writing was something that I've enjoyed. It was a strong suit of mine in school, but I'd forgotten about it almost as a psychology major. You know, my papers were more of like a math equation than anything creative. It was very, you know, you knew what went where. And so something I had lost touch with. And to be honest with you, I work really hard to try to keep up, and it's hard to, I admire the work of so many other people doing my job. And I think I'd probably suffer with something I recently realized had a name, imposter syndrome, where you know, I'm constantly afraid. I'm like, oh gosh, they're gonna find out that I'm not actually a good writer, but that's not, apparently not the case, you know, because I've kept moving forward. But I think a little bit of that, not self-doubt, maybe it started as self-doubt, has evolved into something, again, that's a strength, just trusting that I'm where I'm supposed to be and I'm there for a reason. And maybe a little bit of that self-doubt creeps in and it makes me work a little bit harder, you know, to feel like I'm up to par with my peers in the industry. So
Yeah, really cool. Well, I think the self-doubt thing is something that we all struggle with, whether we're in working in the creative or arts realm or not, you know, and that I totally relate to the imposter syndrome side of things, in so many ways. And I think, you know, again, the same thing with self-doubt. I think there are a lot of the same in many ways, because it's, you know, the only way through is to just do the work and kind of see what comes out on the other side. You know, something that's interesting to me, you have kind of this psychology background and you haven't necessarily applied that in the traditional sense of going into that field of work, but in the creative arts realm and entertainment, something that's tended to come up repetitively a little bit in these conversations is kind of like tying in this, I don't know if you call it like spirituality or like higher spirit of things within creating art in general. And so I'm curious, like, with your approach as somebody that studied psychology, that it, to your point, is very like, if you can't explain it in a scientific form or the mathematical equation of things, um, then translating into more of a creative role, you know, how do those two roads meet in that sense of you coming, I guess, working through those challenges and like finding peace in the fact that like you just got to do what you can do and then let the rest play itself out. Is
yeah.
that is I don't know if I phrased that or like framed that kind of question or conversation, but you know, what are your thoughts in that regards?
Yeah. So as opposed to myself and creative outlet, or you know, artists that I'm talking to.
Well, I think really, I mean, it could go either way. There might be a story from a specific or a story that you have from a specific story that you've written, obviously within all the different, you know, musicians that you've covered and songs and whatnot. But maybe more so for you personally, because for somebody that maybe, and let me back up a little bit. So I've been on this Ram Dass kick lately. So I'm reading all this Ram Dass stuff, and he was a psychology like professor at Harvard, all these things, but then he went on this huge spiritual journey. And so that's one thing he always talks about is like the almost duality in those two things, is that on the psychology, on the educational side, they really, everybody wanted to be able to kind of frame these things with definitions almost. But then
Yeah.
when you come to the spiritual side approach to it, and I think that's where the art side of things with songwriting and those different things come into play, and just any type of creativity or arts, you can't explain a lot of times where the words that you write come from and that nature. So it's a different approach for you because you're not writing music per se, but obviously you're taking somebody else's story and then, putting it into this light and into this certain bit of a creative process, I assume. So, does that, is that,
Yes, no, I got you now. I follow you. I think it's something that like I said, I'm a very distracted person. I was like the kid that couldn't sit down in class my whole life, and so a writer is sort of a hilarious place to envision, picture myself, or like, knowing that part of myself, it's funny to say, but I think and it's something I'm trying to recognize because, like you said, sometimes I try not to read the work that I already put out there because it's up there and it's too late. It's printed. I'm like, all right. But when I do read, sometimes of course we're our own biggest critics. So I looked at things like that. But sometimes I'm like, wow, that was pretty cool. Like I don't even remember saying that. And I think you have to lose, and it's a fine line because I'm responsible for taking a conversation that someone so generously had with me and sharing, feelings and thoughts. And I take that responsibility very seriously. So it is a fine line between being very cognizant of how I am sharing information on behalf of someone else and taking that pressure off of myself at the same time to do it in a way that flows in a way that connects with people, and has to be something that's compelling for someone to read the story anyways. So I think it's a balance I'm still working on, and I didn't think very much about it until you just said that. So it's funny, these are sort of my developing thoughts in real time, but I guess that, and I'm not sure how to reach that, to work on it, but there's a state, and I work my best before 9 a.m. and after dark. It's a terrible habit. I spend 9 to 5 stressing about how I'm not getting anything done, and then get it all done when no one else is awake. And I think it's that being alone, and maybe when you're not on Slack and there's not emails coming in, you feel like you really are in this space where you can take that and do what you want with it and be alone with that work for a minute and meditate over it. But yeah, like I said, I think there's just a space between being very careful and being very mindless at the same time, and trusting yourself to do what you want to do, and giving yourself the space to be creative with something that's sometimes not creative at all. There's hard stories behind people's songs. They usually come from a place of huge transition in people's lives.
yeah, yeah. And
Did I answer your question?
yeah, and I don't know if it was a specific question as much as just my curiosity and what I've found in engaging in these conversations is that what is becoming even more interesting for me is diving into how through their artist and creatives processes, you could say, what are those feelings and what are those maybe things that people can't explain because they are greater than us, and whether you're a religious person or a spiritual person or just believe it's like this cosmic energy, whatever it may be, those are all things that I'm finding that are approached a little bit differently for all these creatives, but also play a very important role in the process sometimes. And to your point, sometimes you don't even realize or notice or recognize it, but it's all happening. So yeah, I think that was good of an answer for me. Uh,
Yeah, it's funny because I think in that, working with creative people all day and hearing their stories, I forget that the work that I'm doing is somewhat creative as well, and so it's funny when I hear that. I just hadn't, it's something I'll get back to you on it, but I don't always consider myself the creative one in the situation, but I guess it's dually creative work.
yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different angle on creativity because to your point, you're really crafting somebody else's story in a lot of ways. So it's not like a creative fiction writer per se that's coming up with the story in their head. And my dad's a creative writer, so like we have these conversations all the time about. He's like, people ask him like, where does that character? How do you come to that depiction of the character? And he's like, I have no idea. It's somewhere up here. I don't know.
Yes.
So it's a little different in that regards, that you're taking a story, but it reminds me a little bit of I think it may have been either an interview that I read or podcast interview with MC Taylor from his Golden Messenger. And he was talking about his transition from moving from West Coast over to the Raleigh Durham area. And then I don't remember exactly what the role was, but it was like some type of almost like a historian type job where he was going around and interviewing these people in Eastern North Carolina and kind of like basically just transcribing these conversations that were in efforts to preserve. I'm assuming, and I'm ad-libbing here because it's been so long, but it reminds me a little bit about the way you're talking about it, because I think his was more of like a direct depiction of what they're saying, but
Yeah.
I think about the relation in him as a songwriter, but you as a journalist writer from a music perspective, and kind of how some of those things come to play. And obviously, you have to your point, take what you're gaining about these stories and really then package it into this digestible format and hopefully like very digestible in the sense that more and more people will read it.
Yeah.
So I would say you should give yourself the creative credit there sometimes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, well, I'll say his Golden Messenger is awesome. They're some of my favorite. I'm actually interviewing him for a print story in April for July, so I'm excited, and I'll have to look into whatever the interview you're talking about as well. But yeah, I think going into, because you want to give someone as much time as they need to tell their story, and sometimes that people have nothing to say after 5 minutes or from the beginning, and that's harder. But I'm able to pull a little bit, but then there's conversations that last for an hour, but in those moments you're like, you want to be respectful of their time. And something that I need to learn is to narrow in on what I need, no matter what it feels like you're leaving behind, because time in that way, if I take too much from someone's story, then I carry all of the weight of every part of their story. And so I deliver something that I don't feel great about, because I'm like, but then they're not going to know about his grandmother from wherever and her influence from immigrating from this country. It's just too much. I go, it's too broad. So I think, like you said, picking the parts that will get people's attention and using that to tell other parts of the story that might be harder to captivate them with otherwise, it's definitely something I'm still practicing, but I guess that is a creative portion of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say this is me projecting maybe a sense of purpose around what you do, but I kind of circling back to that initial question, I've found myself in, not from a songwriting perspective or music perspective for me from like performing, but thinking about being involved with the events that I've helped produce and or market, and trying to place some reason or value in my own work and how that is purposeful in the grander scheme of things.
Yeah.
And that's something I think that's unique in your sense, because you know in a lot of ways you're documenting history, and it's probably when you're in the middle of 5 stories within one day or 2 days or 3 days, you don't think about it like that. But also, like, you're leaving behind a legacy, even if it does live under the American Songwriter brand, whatever it is. Like, there's those things that are always tied back to you telling that story for someone else in a way. So it's really cool for me to have the opportunity to talk to you about this stuff. But again, the more of these conversations I have, the more intrigued I get about how much do people think about those things when you're doing them versus looking back on it. And I know when you're in the midst of it, it's not always easy to like slow down and be self-aware enough to like give yourself that credit, especially when you're like me and you struggling with the imposter syndrome. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes, I know. You want to have to remind yourself what you're doing. And I have a note by my desk to remind myself, because you get so lost in the moment. And I'm like, people are like, wow, that's so cool. That's your job. I'm like, yeah, it's work, like and I'm like, it is cool. Like, I want to recognize that, but I have to remind myself, like, it is cool. Like, this is better than I could have imagined for myself. And so to continue to practice gratitude for that, I think is a good way to grow in that role, because, I'm always just like so excited to talk to all these people, and they're like, wow, it's my dream to, American Songwriter is my favorite. I'm like, oh, really? Like, you're excited to talk to me? But yeah, it's awesome. And I think, like you said, getting back to the psychology portion of it, there are a few different psychology was I enjoyed every part of what I studied, and I don't feel, even with every student loan payment that keeps coming every month, I've yet to regret it. But I think it helps in my approach as well. Like you said, documenting history, it's important to really dig as deeply as you can, without invading someone's privacy, because everyone has different boundaries that way. And you can hear things and you can read things, but of course you prepare questions for an interview. But I would be lying if I said I went in to every interview totally prepared and with plenty of questions, because I have never found that to be the right way. And some people, I'll start broad and they're like, do you mind asking me a question to get me started? And that's just how they work, and that's totally fine. But I feel like having, it's not always things I can point to directly, but I think there's things that I've learned in the past that guide those conversations as they're happening, that cue me about, I think it's okay to dig a little further there, or that's not something that they want to talk about. And this is important. So maybe it's worth asking again, even if it's, you don't know if that's something they want to continue, just sort of the push and pull of each individual person and how willing they are to share certain parts of, their own creative process and this legacy that they're leaving behind with their music, because essentially they're time stamping history with their own personal experience. And I can't imagine how scary that must be for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine for sure, especially across the vast amount of folks that you've kind of interviewed and written stories on. And that's a thing I would go back to. You talk about like the questionnaire kind of approach. There's a lot of journalistic pieces that are really more, it's basically just an interview and it's literally verbatim, like these are the questions I asked and then there was a response. But everything that I've read of yours is it's, you can tell that you spend time and energy and effort on crafting the way that you present it. And yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of time, I definitely want to be mindful of yours, and so let's kind of segue over to my what I call segment two, which is when we dive into some language and maybe how it applies within our daily day-to-day lives, but also trying to, part of the purpose of this podcast for me is to, not only explore these topics with others, but hopefully encourage or inspire the listeners to also think deeply and a little more contemplatively over their own lives and how some of this stuff might play a role. So um, I sent you some of this as prep work, but I read your somewhat recent, I guess it was like 6 or 7 months ago, maybe 8 months ago, interview with Charley Crockett, who I'm a big fan of. I love a lot of his work, and
Yeah.
it was a great article. And so I pulled one of those quotes because he was talking a lot about, and this I think kind of touches on a little bit of the some of that article, and some of his perspective reminds me now that we're talking about like the imposter syndrome or self-doubt.
Mhm.
A lot of that stuff comes from these like social constructs that we've grown up in and around. And obviously with Charlie's specific um, perspective. And for you listeners, you'll have to go read Madeline's interview so that you'll get the full scope of that. But this is just one snippet of a quote that you included in that article that I'll read for the listeners, and then I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts on that. So um, Charlie says, it's those ironies that you think about not before or after surgery, but forever. And to frame this, this is not him quoting now. To frame this he's talking about a very specific medical procedure that he had that was a big turning point, I think, in his life and really kept him alive. But anyways, to go back to the quote, It's those ironies that you think about not before or after surgery, but forever. That shaped me. I can't help but think how much of my fate, luck, or destiny I can't control. He added, I don't think I'm unique in feeling that, especially in 2020. But what can I do? But what I can do is have the courage to change the things that I can control. And because I've done those things, that's the only reason I can think of that I'm alive. And that was such a poignant quote to me because it's so relative. Obviously, he pointed to the fact like in 2020, it's so relative because we're all in our own different ways and own different realities struggling with a lot of self-doubt, a lot of challenges within life and living. But the one thing that you actually do have control over is how you, maybe as an individual, how you react to those things. So, are there any stories or anything you can think of, even if it's just referencing that conversation with him about maybe what you've pulled from conversations about maybe then changing your perspective on how you react or appreciate life and approach life?
Yeah, so Charlie is, I mean, I feel funny calling him Charlie because I think so highly of him, but I think he's one of the, he's going to be, like we're talking about documenting history. When you look at the history of country music, he's doing something and he's done something that we can't turn back from. And we can get into this a little bit more, but it's a strange time professionally and emotionally to be tied to country music and the country music industry because, not all of it, but as a whole, there's parts of that that are not inclusive. Their roots run deep in a system that is, was designed to exclude certain people. And Charley Crockett, like you said, I don't, it would take all day if I got into it, but he said this, or something like this, that his story is too wild, he said too wild or too something of a, for anyone to believe it to be true. He said sometimes he tones it down just so people don't think that he's crazy as he's telling it. But I mean, he's been, he slept on the streets of Paris and lived in bookstores during the day. And I mean, he's just someone, in his, where he comes from too, identity wise, talking to him, he's never felt like he fit in anywhere, and he had never found someone that he looked to and said, hey, that's kind of like me. And for me to hear that as someone who has had every privilege in the world and never struggled to make a friend and has a big family, and that was hard because I look at television and I listen to songs and I look at movies and I see myself everywhere, and I see bits and pieces of my experience in places. And so talking to him really changed the way that I thought about country music and his approach to country music. And in that story, he talks about one specific literary character, and I won't give it away because I think it's a cool story that he got to, and he was like, wow, this is the only person that I think could ever understand what I'm going through. And it was a fictional character. But what he's done is make waves. He doesn't look like anyone in the country music industry. He doesn't sound like anyone in the modern country music industry, and he's not singing about anything that is on the radio. And but he hasn't stopped making music, and he hasn't taken any shortcuts, and he's just really organically grown this following. And at the end of the day, all he's saying is that, he's welcome there just like anyone else is welcome there. And he did it with all of this, every force of nature essentially acting against him. And if he can be doing it, then everyone else can as well. And he talks a little bit about some of the brushes he's had where, other people, there's a way in the music industry, you do this and you get this publishing deal and you get the record deal, then you make an album and it's not all your music, but it sounds good. And then you go on tour, and then while you're on tour, you write your next one and so on. And that's just not the case for him. But he's arrived at the same place that everyone that followed those rules has as well. And so I think for him to take all of those factors working against him and create something beautiful to share that message is is really inspiring to me, and it's something I think about. It's funny that you pulled that because, I talk to so many people a day, but I always go back to that conversation with him because he just doesn't care. He doesn't care about any of those things, and he just wants to share the message that, he's never fit in, but there's a million reasons why you do belong because of, who you are and what the music you make and the stories you have to tell. And so I think, like you said, in this case, he's talking about taking the things he can control, like his music and his life. And, he had influences that set him back, and the things he could control were choosing not to go down several paths of darkness that were presented to him, and keep pushing through and figuring out, the way to where he wanted to go. And I think that he's really impressive for those reasons.
Yeah, he is impressive, and all of those things. It was a great presentation of that. I mean, you're obviously, it's easier sometimes to talk those things through and describing that, but you articulated it very well on paper as well, and I really enjoyed that read, and I also enjoyed his referencing of Bob Dylan about getting to the top, and
Yeah.
nothing matters, and yeah, it was interesting that, like, I'll make sure to share that article, of course, and like the show notes, so as a reference point, so everybody can go find obviously your work in general, but that particular piece also, and his yeah, bringing in the literary stuff I really related to because of my relationship with my dad, and for everybody that's wondering, I won't spill the beans on that character either, but the book is or the author of the book is William Faulkner, and my dad's a huge Faulkner fan, so like there's all these little kind of ties in there that I just really appreciated. But yeah, thanks for sharing that story. And then kind of as I told you via email prior to this, what that made me start thinking about really is how do we take these circumstances and experiences that we have in life and figure out how to use those as learning experiences, maybe to then approach things as we move forward, just as what you just did, from a different frame of perspective possibly than what we've been used to because of the upbringing or the life that we were born into. And it got me thinking about Mahatma Gandhi and some of his quotes around being the change, and then really taking those experiences and not letting them necessarily knock you down, but then maybe making you more aware to make a more conscious decision moving forward. So I'm going to read a couple Gandhi quotes, and then we'll just let you give me your feedback when you hear that, and maybe how, if it all it applies or relates to any of your work, and or if there are, again, any stories similar to the Charley story about maybe things that you've picked up along the way. But of course, everybody knows the Gandhi quote, like, be the change you wish to see in the world. But I pulled a couple other ones that still are relative. And this first one is Gandhi says, "You can't change how people treat you or what they say about you. All you can do is change how you react to it." And it's so simple, but at the same time, so profound, because I think, to your point, to Charley's point, a lot of us at many times in lives probably feel like we're alone and going through things. But the reality is there's so many humans out there that have probably gone through similar things. We're really not alone in that, but we don't talk about it that often. But when you hear that, like, how do you explained a little bit there with the Charley reference, but you know, did that experience in that conversation change maybe, or have you noticed any type of reaction change in yourself when you're having conversations with other artists moving forward after that one? Does that question make sense? Like,
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think, yeah, it's funny that I hadn't even gotten that far, but that's exactly what we were talking about with him, taking um, the past and all these barriers, and for him to just react by making music that's like, I mean, you really can't help but but resonate with it and be drawn to it as any type of uh, listener. And it's something that comes up all the time, with the way that, with American Songwriter, I feel lucky because I get to speak with people who they're not bored of interviews yet. It's something that they're so excited about, and they haven't had every opportunity to share their stories. And so all of those stories always come from so many series of no's until they reach, the most random connection in the world that gets them a yes, that gets them, to where they eventually are. And so I guess I'm always really impressed by the resilience required to continue doing what you're doing. And so in the same way, I think I've allowed myself the same grace, because I'm sitting in these situations where, I messed something up and I didn't take the criticism well, or I didn't get, the pitch didn't go through that I thought would be a really cool story, or, any other challenges that I faced on my way here, to just approach them as just take it for what it is and try to grow from that and keep doing what I know I'm doing well, but learn to take criticism and learn to articulate those no's to see why they're no's, or if I should just brush off the no, because it's not a very, not all no's have a good reason. Sometimes somebody's having a bad day. So I think collecting stories over the years of all the big no's and big rejections that have, created a lot harder implications in people's lives, and learn to just keep pressing forward, and keep, remind yourself of the things that are the good things and what makes you a strong person, to remind yourself that you can move forward from something and continue on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, taking those challenges and those things that don't necessarily go the way you had hoped or expected as an opportunity to maybe approach it differently moving forward, but also not spend too much time, basking in the sadness or the frustration that you felt from that. And that's a lot of what Gandhi goes to talk on about. And like the next quote, I'll just pull snippets of it, but basically he's saying, if we change ourselves, then the tendencies in the world also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does, or I should say, or a woman changes her own nature, so does the attitude of the world change towards him or her. We do not need to wait to see what others do. And that quote, like, I think it's something that I try to live by daily, but it's also keeps coming back up in my life. And I tell all my guests, like, another thing that's kind of pushing these conversations is, for me, is really like meditating a lot more and carving out time to really kind of quiet my mind down from all the distractions and all the things. And then these are the types of questions that come up in my mind about how I'm living and how I could maybe change, and be better suited mentally to not react so negatively to certain things, and just learn
Sure.
experiences. But I think you touched on a lot of that stuff. And at the end of the day, you gotta get up to bat and take your swings and just keep on going. You can't, if you bask in it, in that like, sulking of the sadness too long, you're not gonna take another swing, I guess.
Yeah, and I think too, something that came to mind, because we haven't really talked about it yet, with that, we've experienced a year that changes everything, whether it, people don't want to accept that, but it's changed everything, especially looking at the music industry and just chronicling people's experience, talk about taking down history, the lowest lows in April, May, June, like, what am I going to do? I can't keep making music, my house, my this, my, no, it's scary, and it's been hard times for people, but I think as it's evolved, and not everyone, but those fortunate enough to have survived with some level of comfort, have found a silver lining, and it's the people that I wouldn't expect, talking to country stars that spend 70-80% of their year on a tour van. They're like, I got to be dad and I got to tuck my kids into bed, and in turn, I have all of this, I've been home and I've thought and I've written in a notebook that's not on a moving van or a hotel room. And I think the way in which people have changed their course of living, whether, life, career, the way they write music, the way they approach anything, there's an opportunity here for us to move forward in the way that we were, and accept this as last time, or to really change things for good and for the better. And the more I talk to people, every person I've talked to, I would say in the last 4 months has a silver lining because they've had time to reflect. And we're also at the point now where it was funny in the beginning, people weren't sharing anything, and then they were sharing work that predates the pandemic. So it just was either felt insensitive, or I was like, how do you think this overlays with the current context?
Yeah.
You can't not talk about what's going on. But finally, bits and pieces of these pieces of art created, driven from fear and isolation and doubt, and all of these things are coming to life. And I think it changes what music sounds like for the next 5 years or so. These stories will continue to unfold with a bit of perspective. But talking about tendencies and the way you do things, like I was talking to Zach from Portugal the Man, and I was like, they were talking about, creating at home and being in nature and all these wonderful things that have come from their music as they've reflected. And I was like, are you excited to get back on the road, or do you want to change that? Are you are you re-energized, or are you second guessing? And some people have said, like, I don't even want that. He said something funny. He said he compared it to when you go to your mom's house and she really wants to play a board game like Scrabble, and you're like, no, and you're kicking and screaming, and finally you do it, and then 5 minutes later you're having a great time. You're like, oh yeah, I love board games. He's like, that's the entrance that will be there. But there's certain things that have to be in play, like more days off, more time in nature, smaller cities, like the things that, because the way and the pace in which life was moving before this happened was not sustainable. So I think talking about, if every person is brave enough to re-enter the world, having reflected on what's changed within themselves, and bring that forward in a new way. I know everyone's eager to get back to the way things were, but I hope it's not a missed opportunity. And I know for myself, certainly, there's things that I want to change about, the way that I work and live and interact and move. And I think if everyone is brave enough to do that, then the world will be a really different place in a good way.
Yeah, 100%. That you essentially said in your own words, "I'll put you up there with Gandhi." You know, that's exactly what he's saying. And there's been many quotes that I've read that really, and one is just, I think it was Deepak Chopra, who said, as you change or transform yourself, the world around you begins to change and transform as well. And so, to your point, if we all take those silver linings and really start to apply them, and that is a tough thing. I mean, even here, I can see it in going. I ran into some folks last night at the local market up the street, and they were like, they live in the neighborhood here. And last year I did this thing where I just set up in the front yard, and a lot of musicians had done it. And then all the neighbors set up in their yards and have drinks and cook out or whatever.
How fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And they were saying, they're like, I'm so happy that we're getting back to some sense of normalcy. But at the same time, like, I'm already nostalgic for those, like, everybody's just chilling at home and we're all doing it as a community together in our own ways, and so hopefully we don't, like, come into this new roaring 20s without keeping those silver linings as a remembrance, and something that help us with our day to day, because they are important. And I think, to your point, with the industry as a whole, hopefully, and I can say this as well as somebody that gets caught up in the fast pace of it all. Hopefully the goalposts change a little. We don't have to be doing it all the time, every day, day in and day out, because it certainly creates burnout for people, I'm sure. And um, so, well, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, even though we're not in your working hours, since you don't get dark. But I do want to be mindful of that. So, and I appreciate you. So, segment 3 is basically just, do you have any, it can be local to, you said you're in Raleigh still, so it could be local to Raleigh or it could be anywhere, but any organizations, could be faith-based, profit-based, or nonprofit-based, or just a cool small business that you want to shout out that you think needs some love, that maybe haven't received it lately.
Ooh, that's a hard one. I think tying in a little bit of all of this, I was lucky enough to be connected with Headcount, which is a nonpartisan voter organization that's tied with the music industry. So I was doing some non-writing work, digital media, project management work for a text campaign of theirs, but it tied in a lot of what I cared about, which was, voter education, and the importance of, people don't understand. I was raised in North Carolina, so I've always been taught that your vote counts, like, not that it counts more than anyone else, but you never know how it's going to turn out. And until I was in college in Tennessee, with an election going on, I was all fired up, and people were like, "Oh, I don't vote because, I live in this state, which is typically a red or blue state. So if I vote, it doesn't change it," which, isn't the case. But I had never considered that people felt that way.
Oh,
Um,
do
and so, yeah, and so getting into the data of, who participates, I was like, wow, this is crazy that young people don't feel called to participate in this. So I think being able to educate voters, which highlights, another, I think all of our greatest inequalities in this country begin with an education system. And I was brought up in the public education system here, and with the help of my community, it didn't fail me, but it fails people all the time, who fall through the cracks. So presenting information, and then also having the music industry and people with any type of platform, no one's asking, people are asking, but it's not required that you use that platform, to educate people and to push agendas and, to bring change forward. But I think it's always a shame when I see a missed opportunity, from an artist, and specifically, and I hate to say this because I'm involved in the country music industry a lot, but a lot of the silence that met the revolution of this year was disappointing. And so that to then work with Headcount during the election this year and see that there are other people that are being brave, and it doesn't mean you have to pick a side. It's just you're using your platform to help others who don't have one, and to reach people where that are typically hard to reach, because you never know whose message is going to get to someone, and that could change, the course of these people's lives and in turn history. So I think that's something I felt very passionately about. Raleigh's a great town. There's amazing people doing amazing things here all the time. Band Together is an amazing initiative that, changes every year. Right now, we're feeding hungry kids. And I think, especially not being in school this year, where a large percentage of North Carolina public school students count on, receiving breakfast and lunch, that has been stripped. So they're doing amazing stuff too.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll make sure to share both organizations, and I love the stuff on Headcount. And we didn't even get into it. I really wanted to also ask about some of your political work and some of those other things, just more so out of curiosity, and how they tie into everything else that you've done. Because I'm sure there's some interesting cross pollination of those things, but we'll save that for a round two or something. So
Sure, definitely. I would love to get into that. Yeah, no, the political stuff is, it's everywhere, and it's, especially this past year, it's been interesting, to hear it all in music and conversation and all that. But yeah, I don't want to bore anyone going in there, so we'll have to save it.
yeah, well, cool. Well, Madeline, thank you so much. I'm so very appreciative of your time, and I'm sure my listeners will be. And yeah, so for if somebody wants to kind of follow along with what you're doing and where your work is these days, is do you want them to follow your social handles, your personally, or obviously I'll link American Songwriter stuff too and your profile there, but tell folks where you would suggest them go to kind of follow along your journey and your stories.
Sure, I would say my website if I put any effort into it, but I always forget. So I think Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah.
Twitter, I don't post it. I just repost my work. Instagram, I try to keep up with, what I've done, but I think those two are probably the most up to date.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll make sure to link those in as well. But yeah, thanks again for your time, and keep
Thank
writing
you.
amazing stories. And listeners, thank you for tuning in. We will see you next week on another episode of Dharma Digs. Namaste. Have a great day.